and welcome to Season 14, Episode 3 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop. You seem a little under the weather. Or
I'm I'm not under the weather. Maybe I'm
oh,
just tired.
your eyes look like they're gonna shut.
No. Huh. That's just kind of insulting, I think, because I didn't think I looked like that.
Well, pep it up a little, mister.
Because we were talking just beforehand that I've got some really bad facial hair going on right now because I'm doing a no-shave Lent. You can't really even see it on the Zoom. It's more evident in person. But I had a meeting with a couple people, a couple friends on Wednesday. I came in and I sat down. This girl looks, she goes, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Ouch, man! I didn't realize it looked that bad." And then the day after that in the evening, I just meet up some other friends, and somebody sits next to me. She says, "Oh, you're still doing the no shaving thing." I said, "Yeah, it doesn't look good at all." She goes, "Well, I'm glad you recognize that." And I'm like, "Man, I'm just getting attacked from all sides here." But it's right at that perfect point in time where it just doesn't look good at all, but it's very noticeable that it's happening. So hopefully it fills in a little bit. But it's
I
not
don't think
going
it's
well.
going. I don't think it's going to.
Yeah.
I didn't notice it at first, and
Hmm.
now that I'm putting my eyes near the screen, I see a little bit. You remind me of what's the name of that sidekick in the Percy Jackson, the one that's a half goat character?
Oh, is it Grover? Grover from the
Grover the
Percy Jackson
Satyr.
books.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Grover the Satyr. He has like whiskers on his chin because he's a goat. Yeah, that's what you look like.
Thanks. Well, it's also because of the lighting in here. It looks really
Oh,
much darker in the
oh,
bottom of my chins. It's in
uh,
person you can see it on the cheeks a little bit more, but it's
really? Is there something on the cheeks? Oh,
yeah,
yeah. Okay. Okay.
yeah. It's just the lighting doesn't help, but it
Yeah.
also doesn't look good anyway. So
So you're going to do that the whole Lent?
that's what I'm gonna try for. It's testing my patience and my humility because I know it looks terrible.
Okay. Well, that's one way. It's kind of like, uh, the monks that would go around and whipping themselves and stuff.
Hmm. Hmm.
You create your own adversity. So that's good.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's penance in
Yes.
in
Yeah.
its own way.
Yes. I've
Uh,
always been curious about how it would look. I've only ever gone like the longest I've gone before this was like 3 days without shaving, and it drove me crazy. So I've
yes.
always been curious to see what would happen. This seemed like a good enough excuse, if any. So we'll see what happens.
Well, I still have my beard going,
You do, yeah.
and it's very gray.
It is.
Yes.
It's almost white now on your
Yeah.
chin. It's not even
Yeah.
like gray anymore. It's more of just a white.
Well, yeah, the longer I let it grow out, the whiter it is. I don't
Yeah,
know why that is the case. It doesn't seem like it's physically possible because you'd
yeah.
think it'd be the same color from end to end. But in any event, eventually, I guess I could be like a mall Santa Claus.
That's
Uh,
true.
but of course, I would never be a mall Santa Claus because you know what my theory of Santa Clauses are.
That's true. Yes, that they're all creeps.
Yeah, because no man in his right mind would voluntarily spend that much time with strange children.
That's yeah, yeah. Alternatively, you could end up looking like an Ayatollah of Iran,
Oof,
if
watch
there will
out.
be yeah any left. Um,
I guess the second string guy got they said he might have got offed. The
yeah, I
second
think just
string guy.
earlier today. Yeah,
But I guess the Ayatollah is kind of like the Pope. Like
yeah,
you have the Ayatollah, and then if he dies, then the next guy is still the Ayatollah.
yeah. They can assign. I don't know what their process is, but a new one is
But
assigned of some sort.
does the Ayatollah mean the head dude?
Yeah, it's a religious and a political authority because they have essentially like the Islamic theocracy over there.
Yeah.
So it's both a religious and a
I just
political thing.
didn't know if that title was like priest. Like there's a bunch of Ayatollahs and
Mm.
he's a supreme Ayatollah. I don't know.
There might be, yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah. But anyway, aside from facial hair in Iran, we are, of course, reading The American Conservative by Russell Kirk, or not The American Conservative, The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk. This time we're talking about an American, John Adams and Liberty Under Law. So last time we talked a lot about Burke and Burke's ideas, especially of tradition and sort of maintaining order and everything like that. Now we're sort of getting an example of what this looks like in an American context with John Adams. I enjoyed this chapter. I especially enjoyed how he contrasted him with several other sort of related thinkers. Now that I've read this chapter, I feel like that was something that was missing from Burke. because a lot of it was just Burke against, the extreme opposite end of the spectrum and the French Revolution, but not a lot of people who might have, been more closely aligned with Burke and sort of what the more subtle differences are. But this time I think we had a good discussion, especially of John Adams in contrast with Alexander Hamilton, which was really interesting. And Russell Kirk holds up Adams as the sort of truer conservative of the two, which I thought was an interesting analysis.
Yeah, I've read, it was years ago, but I read the biography of Adams.
Hmm.
There's a big tome by McCullough. He's done a lot of political
Hmm.
figures, and it was a big book, and I really enjoyed it. It was a little long on the he had like access to all his writings and letters and stuff, and so he had long excerpts of his many letters back and forth to his wife, which were fascinating at first, but at some point he's beating a dead horse. But other than that criticism of it, it's an excellent book. And because he was away from home so often, and of course back then you'd write more.
Hmm.
There's so much of his public thought and private thought on public issues was available, which I think is fascinating. Not only just like if he published books or whatever. I just was really interested and became a fan of
Hmm.
Adams at the time, and I'm more of a fan of his than Thomas Jefferson.
Oh yeah.
Although I'm not a fan of Jefferson.
Hmm.
I had to pick one or the other. I'd pick Adams, but then like even the author points out, Jefferson was more of a revolutionary in theory than in practice.
Hmm.
Especially with the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, what was the constitutional authority for buying that? And some of the other, once you're in office, a lot of times you make compromises, or you're forced to make decisions, which may not be consistent with your most absolute political persuasion or whatever. But
Right.
I liked how he gave Adams credit for he's a contemporary of Burke. And I expect that he didn't do a comparative analysis of Burke because Burke is really is the book is focused on American conservative thought. I think
Hmm. Well,
like
English and American.
yeah. So I think the getting that comparative analysis of Adams is probably more readily apparent and more relevant
Right. Right.
for these discussions. But yeah, I appreciated that too.
Right.
And Hamilton, of course, subsequent to this book, he's been deified by the terrible musical,
Oh
Hamilton,
yeah. Oh yeah.
which still bothers me.
Oh yeah. Drives me insane.
I, I went to that, and I mean, I guess I shouldn't say it's terrible, mediocre. Um, I mean, the music and the
Mm.
plot, and it was kind of funny because I think Hamilton was more of a monarchist.
Hmm.
Certainly believed in centralized power,
Yeah.
and did not want to have. He wanted to have less democracy
Hmm.
than what resulted in the Constitution, clearly. But all the left wing people are like, "Oh, Hamilton, oh
Hmm.
Hamilton," you know,
Right.
the,
Well,
the
I mean,
word.
the musical doesn't really tap into that side of Hamilton very much. I don't think. I think
That's
it's
kind
more
of
so. Yeah.
it reminded me of the producers, you know,
I've never seen it.
um, with the famous musical number "Springtime for Hitler."
Oh, I've heard of it. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
It's a really funny movie. I mean, aside from that, and it's horrible that you now know that exists
Mm.
because to see it and to not expect that musical number and then not to expect the audience reaction, which is a complete surprise, it's just brilliant writing. And that was
Hmm.
that was Mel Brooks, I believe.
Yeah.
And I read his autobiography and pretty good, but he's a lefty,
Hmm.
Mel Brooks.
Hmm.
And I'm thinking, I don't know. Anyway, I don't need to go down that
Yes.
path.
Well, let's start talking about the book a little bit here, because he does a good job, I think, of setting up sort of what the big discussion is here for the chapter. Right, he says on the first page here, he says, "This severe and forthright little Massachusetts lawyer spent the greater part of his life declaring, with perfect indifference to popularity, that freedom can be achieved and retained only by sober men who take humanity as it is, not as humanity should be." Right, and that's his discussion of liberty having to take place under law. Right, you need law, you need order in order for liberty to occur. And I like this discussion right on page 63, talking about the Federalists. But first, he sort of makes the point, as Burke puts it, that the American Revolution was not an innovating upheaval, but a conservative restoration of colonial prerogatives. As Burke puts it, a revolution not made, but prevented. And that, of course, becomes Russell Kirk's, sort of big thesis in the Roots of American Order, the other book of his that I've read, where he says, like, well, no, it's actually just a preservation of a way of life and a broader Western tradition rather than anything entirely new, right? It was just a keeping the same culture, keeping the same society, but sort of changing who is the head of government, sort of a conservative revolution, if a thing is possible, or not even a revolution at all, as Burke would kind of have it.
Yeah, and in that sense, it's unusual historically.
Oh yeah.
I think that analysis is correct. And then, what's going on now in America is kind of like from the '60s to Trump was kind of like a counter-revolution. That's what they
Hmm.
called it, the counterculture. But it was peaceful generally,
Hmm.
uh, and changing our society, and then like I guess really starting with the progressive reforms of direct election of senators and a number of different amendments. And then now it's almost like a counter revolution that may be starting, but it's interesting with that the progressives really wanted to consolidate in some ways presidential power, but now they're realizing that empowers the other side if they get into
Hmm.
power. Um, I think the current era may be the beginning of the restoration, arguably, of the original constitutional norms, if it all works out right. Otherwise,
Hmm.
it's going to be haywire, and we're all going to be screwed.
Right. Right. I
But
like how
yeah,
he.
but I do like that analysis of it. I think
Mhm.
it's accurate. Of the revolution not being revolutionary, which
Right.
is you'd say, well, that doesn't make sense, but it does if you explain it the way you did very effectively.
Right. I like how he sets up the Federalists too. This is also on page 63, sort of setting the stage. He says these Federalists, the first conservative faction in an independent America, found themselves menaced by two radicalisms, one of French origins, the same enormous social and intellectual convulsion that Burke confronted, the other a growth in part native and in part English, the leveling agrarian republicanism of which Jefferson was the chief representative, anxious to abolish entail, primogeniture, church establishments, and all the vestiges of aristocracy, and to oppose centralization, strong government, state debt, in the military. So he says that's really sort of the what the Federalists were fighting against, right? Sort of some sort of a middle ground or some sort of a more conservative ideal, as opposed to these two sort of what Kirk calls two different radicalisms, the
Yeah,
French and then sort of the homegrown sort of English republicanism, agrarian republicanism.
yeah. And the only criticism of the author is I think he gives Adams a little bit too much credit
Hmm.
about not, I think ultimately Adams articulates, as we'll get to, his an effective definition and an appropriate definition of aristocracy. But I think he was not a royalist,
Hmm.
but I don't know that he would have been opposed to having George Washington be a
Right.
head of state as opposed to a president. Much like a king, I think Hamilton certainly would have, and a lot of their supporters were in favor of an American monarchy.
Right.
And so I think Adams was more intellectually, he understood the problems with that, but he was, it wasn't a completely unfair criticism that people thought that Adams was in favor of an aristocracy similar to the English
Hmm.
aristocracy. But I think later in life he defined it more favorably to him, if that
Right.
makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, so I think certainly the author's a fan of Adams
Hmm.
in his thought, and as I am, but I don't know if I agree that there was not some legitimate criticism on that end.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. But he kind of sets up right before we even discuss Adams. He says one needs to look at the more nearly orthodox federalism of Hamilton and Ames. He says even within sort of the Federalists, John Adams was not necessarily a typical one, even though
Yeah.
he was really the only like Federalist president. 'Cause he mentions, sort of the election in 1800, right? There were no Federalists after that, right? John Adams is the only person who's officially elected on sort of the Federalist Party platform in some way. But he says, let's look at Hamilton and Ames first. Right, and he says he starts with this quote from Hamilton. He says, "In the commencement of a revolution which received its birth from the usurpations of tyranny, nothing was more natural than that the public mind should be influenced by an extreme spirit of jealousy." So Alexander Hamilton spoke to the Convention of New York in 1788. To resist these encroachments and to nourish this spirit was the great object of all our public and private institutions. The zeal for liberty became predominant and excessive, and forming our confederation, this passion alone seemed to actuate us, and we appear to have had no other view than to secure ourselves from despotism. But there's another object equally important, in which our enthusiasm rendered us little capable of regarding. I mean a principle of strength and stability in the organization of our government and of vigor in its operations. And what Kirk sort of describes is he sort of takes that to the highest extreme, at least in his reading of Hamilton. That Hamilton was much more, like we mentioned, this centralized person, really wary of sort of democratic impulses, really concerned about sort of this over excessive zeal for liberty. And so we need to have a strong, very stable, very centralized government in order to sort of be the stop to that, right? And to keep the people in check. You need to have this strong government to keep the people in check, so you don't have this over excessive liberty. Which I thought is an interesting quote to start with here, and I think sums up a lot of what Kirk has to say about Hamilton here.
Yes. Good job. I mean,
Thank you.
I don't know that I need to elaborate on that. I mean, I think Hamilton was much more of a believer in central government than even Adams was,
Yeah.
and if I remember correctly, Hamilton was less trustful of the popular vote.
Hmm.
Democracy and expanding, the ability to vote in elections and all that, um, and wanted a more efficient unitary executive without really articulating or maybe he understood the dangers of that, but he certainly didn't articulate that he understood that there are
Hmm.
dangers to individual liberty by having more centralized control. It's um, it's funny that people can have a distrust for the public,
Hmm.
but not distrust some sort of centralized government
Right.
who necessarily have to be ruled by somebody who's a human. I mean,
Hmm.
how is it the masses cannot, are easily swayed by demagogues when, the leadership's not? I mean,
Hmm.
it's like, well, if at least if the masses have a vote, then you can have two competing demagogues. I mean,
Right.
if you only have one person in charge, then that person gets swayed and makes mistakes, then we're all screwed. And there's less of a check on their power.
Hmm.
And for some reason, people that believe in centralized power never recognize the fallibility of the individual aristocracy. It's one of my criticisms of Plato, that the select few are going to be able to make
Hmm.
better decisions than everybody. Well, who
Right.
said that? Oh, our educational system will end up whatever.
Right. Right.
Um, so I don't need to go back to Plato, but
Right. Another important point of Hamilton's sort of political theory is also his economic theory, right? As Russell Kirk puts it, this is on page 68. He says it's basically mercantilism, right? And he really emphasized the industrialization of America. He says commerce and manufacturers, he believed, would produce a body of wealthy men whose interests would coincide with those of the national commonwealth. Probably he conceived of these pillars of society as being very like great English merchants purchasing country estates, forming presently a stable class possessed of leisure, talent, and means, providing moral and political and intellectual leadership for the nation. He says, well, of course, the American model doesn't exactly work out that way. You can't just, copy and paste a social class from the entire opposite, or from across the entire ocean and be like, well, if we put up similar economic practices, this same social order will come to exist. And that's, I think, what he says is really one of Hamilton's big flaws, is trying to go too far into this economic idea, and giving too much sort of credit to this sort of pillars of society that he presumably thought would emerge, but didn't in quite the same way.
yeah, I mean, I think it's just more of the same what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
But I think Hamilton was correct in a lot of what he does, or did. as Secretary of the Treasury initially, because he realized that like we had 13 states,
Hmm.
and so that it was necessary to have a unified rules of commerce. And if not for Hamilton, I don't know that our country would have survived very long,
Yeah.
because there's so many rivalries between different states that had either manufacturing or they had agrarian
Hmm.
based economies, and they all wanted to have their own tariffs and rules and regulations. They all wanted to protect their own industries. So a lot of his mercantilism and his economic theory were just correct
Yeah.
about how to deregulate the economy among the states in
Hmm.
particular, because his view was we're all the same country now, and so I think this criticism might be a little unfair of
Hmm.
Hamilton in his role as an economic advisor and policymaker for the one country. I don't know that this really reflects necessarily on his political philosophy writ large. Once the system is operational now, of course, he had some writings before, and he really was a strong proponent of a central government for economic reasons, and for a bank,
Right.
a federal bank that would be have the same currency and have a lot of discretionary power. Uh, I think he'd be, I think his critics would be aghast at our current Fed.
Right.
You know,
Right.
what they feared was what we have,
Hmm.
which is much more expansive than what Hamilton was even advocating for at the time. But
Right. Yeah, it's
um, I,
interesting. I've been reading. There's a professor here at Hamilton. Was originally from Venezuela. He has me read through his like drafts of his papers and correct them for like grammar and stuff. Not that his grammar's bad, more so just for wording because it's
yeah,
slightly awkward. If your first language is in English, and a
like
lot of the
the use of idioms and that
yeah,
sort of.
yeah, 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 exactly. So it's not like he doesn't have a grasp of the English language by any means. His writing's fine, just for like sake
Yeah,
of readability and things like that. But a lot of the articles that he's been writing recently have been arguing essentially that Hamilton had a much more classical or sort of medieval conception of like a lot of his political theory, which is really interesting
yeah,
compared to a lot of the other sort of framers and founding fathers and things like that. Especially in his economic policy, he puts forward a pretty good argument that Aristotle or that Hamilton is drawing sort of on Aristotelian conceptions of economy and things like that, rather than sort of the Enlightenment thinkers, and because he differs from them in a lot of ways, and especially in the
yeah,
more sort of philosophical concepts that he
yeah.
puts forward, and even in the Federalist Papers themselves, when he's talking about like how we know things, it seems much more sort of a classical conception rather than the what a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers say. So it's an interesting idea of Hamilton sort of being a bridge to the more traditional rather than just the Enlightenment.
And the Federalist Papers, well, first of all, I find them hard to read. It's like a different vocabulary.
Hmm.
But those were also unique in the sense that they were advocating for an existing for a compromised system.
Hmm.
They're advocating for the Constitution as everybody kind of, I don't know if reluctantly agreed with. I don't know if they should say reluctantly, but they're arguing for. I don't know. It's not a purely philosophical tome. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying? So
yeah,
you're arguing in favor of a particular policy as opposed to, but I guess maybe that's what all political theory.
that's true.
Maybe I'm talking myself out of my own position.
Well, there you go.
Who says I can't change my mind? I just did a mid sentence. You're always so certain. You're always so certain of everything you say. Well, then how do you explain that last
Well,
little
it
paragraph?
was you convincing yourself. So I think the question still remains if anybody else can convince you that you're wrong.
Um, is that relevant?
Oh my gosh.
Well, no. Honestly,
Hmm.
who convinces any of us that we're wrong but us?
Mm. Yeah.
Because somebody will say something, and only if I listen to it and consider it,
Yes, that's
then
true.
I decide whether that you are right or wrong,
Hmm.
or whether I'm right or wrong.
Hmm.
But nobody is completely is just overwhelmed unless you're like brainwashed or
That's
tortured.
true. Yeah. Ultimately, you have to be the one assenting to whatever it is that they're putting
Yes.
forward. Yeah. No, that's true.
So of course I'm the only one that can convince me I'm wrong. That's true of all of us.
It's fair enough.
And I think that's a little bit more meaningful a statement than I intended it to be.
Hmm.
But that's so true if you're trying to convince other people that they're wrong.
Hmm.
You can't convince them they're wrong. Only they can convince them they're wrong. So you
Hmm.
have to figure out a way to get them to convince themselves they're wrong.
Hmm.
That's really what persuasion is,
Yeah,
isn't it?
I would agree. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Somebody has to have articulated that before.
I'm
I,
certain
I
of it.
couldn't I couldn't have just come up with that on my own. I mean, I did,
Hmm.
but somebody else would have had to done that before me, don't you think?
Yes. Yeah, that's, I feel like I've read similar things somewhere,
Hmm.
but I can't place exactly where. So for now, I'll give you the credit. But
Thank
we
you.
should move on to Fisher Ames, right? So it's essentially his
Yes.
argument about Hamilton, is that
Yes.
Hamilton was much more, sort of centralized, much more interested in sort of these economic policies. John Adams differs from him, as we will see. He says the other side of things, sort of within the Federalists, is Fisher Ames, who I've only ever heard mentioned sort of as side notes, if ever at all, in terms of sort of, founding and important figures. So I haven't read any of his stuff directly. I'm not very even much familiar with who this guy really was,
Me neither.
up until reading a lot of this. Right, but he says he was really a proponent of a more aristocratic proclivity. This is what Russell Kirk says on page 71. He says, of this aristocratic proclivity among the Federalists, which the younger Adams remarks, Ames was the ablest spokesman. He was a stern moralist, and with few exceptions, conventional moralists have doubted the virtue of the common man in politics. The foreboding Ames was the most cogent representative, too, of that pessimistic inclination toward contracting their lines which prevailed among the Federalists after they began to lose ground to republicanism. Right, so Ames really wanted to have this strong aristocratic element within the United States, right? So in contrast to Hamilton, who wanted sort of the centralized, strong central government, he was advocating slightly differently, right? A strong aristocracy within the government, and ultimately his ideas did not win out in quite the way that he wanted them to.
Well, and I like, I don't know anything about him either.
Hmm.
Or if I knew him, I forgot him. But the one of the things that really resonated with me was he was talking about the need to have moral habits in order
Hmm.
to have a functioning liberty, and I think that's true. And we've talked about that in other episodes and that kind of thing. So I thought that was an interesting thought. He's obviously seems to be less trusting of having democratic influence
Oh
in
yeah.
policy than Adams was.
Yeah.
Sure.
I,
Yeah.
I like this quote from him on page 72. He says, our country is too big for union, too sordid for patriotism, too democratic for liberty. What is to become of it, he who made it best knows. Its vice will govern it by practicing upon its folly. This is ordained for democracies. He was a much more pessimistic voice in sort of the early days of our country. And to a certain extent, I don't necessarily disagree with them here, especially, 250 years later. I think you could say a lot of the same things nowadays.
Yeah.
Very true.
Yes. Agreed.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know if there's too much else to say about Ames here. I mean, he's a good sort of, example to say of, what are these different voices within federalism, right? You have the centralism of Hamilton, and you have this very aristocratic, very moralist perspective of Ames. John Adams is kind of in between the two,
Mm.
is ultimately Russell Kirk's ideas. Should we just move on to John Adams more directly?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, you want me to take the lead for a second or
sure.
not?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't need to. I don't want
No,
to.
no, no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, he gets into his writings in response, in defense of the Constitution, and I thought it was interesting where goes on and page 77. I might be
Hmm.
skipping,
Yeah, that's all
but
right.
it's a refutation of Rousseau's theories in favor of democracy, pure democracy. But he says, talking about the Whig and the Federalist, is both declare the necessity of religious belief to sustain society, both exalt practical considerations above abstract theory, which I love, and both contrast a man's imperfect real nature with the fantastic claims of the philosophers, both stand for balanced government, which recognize the natural distinction of man, class from class, interest from interest. And I think that, he's comparing favorably Adams to Burke, I mean,
Hmm.
that they're both very similar, the Whig Burke and the Federalist Adams, that they have a lot of similarities in those views. And
Hmm.
I think that's an accurate description of the main similarities and really important similarities.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I like what he says about the differences. This is a little bit lower down in 77. He says it's essentially the same principles, but like with different weapons. He says where Burke talked of prejudice, prescription, and natural rights, Adams attacked the doctrine of perfectibility and the idea of a unitary state. Right. He says first we're going to talk about his analysis of human nature. Second, his analysis of the state. Right. And I thought that was interesting. Right. That Burke is more trying to set up. It seems like a more philosophical basis, like we talked about last time. Like he didn't really want to. He didn't want to talk about the abstract, but he was kind of forced to provide a philosophy sort of for the English against the French here. Adams doesn't necessarily need to set up a whole philosophical structure, right? He doesn't need to talk about prejudice, prescription, natural rights. He just needs to argue against perfectibility, against the idea of unitary state. So it seems like almost in some ways even more practical, more focused on what the problem is in the given moment, rather than setting up a full-fledged sort of philosophical system of some sort.
Well, that and he had an example of the practical way to design it, being the federalist system. That we
Hmm.
have the divided government with the legislative, executive, and the judiciary.
Hmm.
So it was more of a defense of an existing constitution,
Yeah.
and so you could be a lot more practical and slightly less on theory.
Hmm.
Because you're talking about, okay, how do we do this? So what's important in these principles?
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting. This is just on page 78 now. This discussion of John Adams sometimes being labeled a utilitarian or a materialist, right? Because he has some discussions, right, where he says the first want of man is his dinner, and the second his girl, were truths well known to every democrat and aristocrat long before the great philosopher Malthus arose to think he enlightened the world by the discovery. Right? And a lot of people read this. He says, oh, well, he thinks man is just governed by desire, right? And whatever, sort of positive, negative you give him, right? That's sort of how you control people. That's how you sort of run a society. What Russell Kirk says, well, that's just an extreme surface level reading of Adams' thought. Right, he says this is a mere contemptuous half concession. Man's nature, Adams believed, is something much deeper than a simple material wants. Men are weak and foolish, especially when deprived of proper leadership and good institutions, but they are not mere creatures of appetite, nor are they by instinct selfish. So he says, right, this is the problem that you run into, right? He's sort of diagnosing the problem, not saying that this is just naturally what men are all the time, right? There's a problem of people sometimes being guided more so by their wants rather than by anything higher. And that's where you get the sense of liberty under law that we're going to talk about in a little bit, that you need to have this ordered structure first, so that, sort of the bad actors among men, don't, just pursue their wants all the time. Right. It's not that every man is like this. It's not just that it's this utilitarian materialist principle, right? We can use reason. We use reason under the law and to craft law, in order to have sort of a well-functioning society.
Yes. And then he goes on, they mentioned Plato, and Adam said he didn't learn really much of anything from Plato, but the other points out that they basically both agree that happiness is that justice is essential for a happy life and happiness.
Right.
Um, and uh, and so that that's of course what Plato's whole theory was. Now how he arrived at it, it would be up to debate,
Hmm.
obviously. But I thought that was kind of interesting.
Right, right. He has similar notes to Burke then, a little bit after that. Right, the idea of right these religious institutions being very critical, right, for the existence of a society. Right, he says this is on page 80, or a little bit before that, I suppose, is really where he's talking about that. But he makes sort of another point on page 80 here. Right, he says, late in life, Adams informed Jefferson that he was indeed a believer in the probable improvability and improvement, the ameliorability and amelioration in human affairs, but could never understand the doctrine of perfectibility of the human mind, which
Yes.
appeared to him fantastic as Hindu fakirs trust in ceremonial repetition as a means of attaining omniscience. Progress, on the contrary, is the slow and painful ascent of the blind led by the one-eyed, dependent upon conservative institutions and the will of God. Real progress would be obliterated for an indefinite period by wild snatches at perfection. Right? He says progress, if we want to have positive change, right? Very similar to Burke, right? It's this incremental thing, the slow thing, this working with the institutions, right? Not just jumping, striving to achieve, perfectibility all at once. Things can get better. We can set up laws, we can set up a government that can help make things better, but things can never be perfect, and they can only ever be guided. Right, the one-eyed man leading the blind, right? It's not a perfect man leading the blind up into the sunlight out of the cave. To come back to Plato a little bit, right? It's something a little bit more measured than that.
Well, and it's not just that the circumstances can't be perfected; it's that man can't be perfected.
Right.
That is one of the scariest things when any politician or somebody even near power or the potential having power believes that people can be perfected in any way through any measure, because that's an autocrat in the making for
Hmm.
sure. Because what you end up doing is you take increasingly forceful measures to perfect everybody,
Hmm. Right.
and everything is justifiable. And also, you're dealing with complete theory when examples of government spending on social programs. If you don't recognize that there's a certain percentage of people that will rip off the program. If you don't
Hmm.
recognize that, you're not going to have the correct controls in place, and you're not going to have the right qualifications. Like, so you're not going to audit it for theft, and you're not going to say, well, look, if you're an able-bodied 25-year-old guy,
Hmm.
we're not going to give you free stuff. You'll work for it, and because you think people are generally good, and they're in a natural state, they'll be perfect. When in fact, if you just hand out stuff, a lot of people will just take it because
Right.
they're lazy or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that goes hand in hand, and I think that's one of the more probably, I guess, the basis. My feeling that that's the basis for how the French Revolution became so evil so
Hmm.
quickly,
Yeah.
and how people are so wrong about social science decisions. Like when they talk about like any sort of social change, like if we just change the laws, it changes your soul.
Hmm.
Makes everybody better. Well, we're going to outlaw hate speech. What does that even mean? I mean, and who's hate? And so will we actually eliminate hate? Of course not, because hate's in your heart. It's not
Right.
words. The words is just articulating what you're thinking. So
Hmm.
but you think, well, I can perfect society if I just outlaw it,
Right.
bad things, and
Right.
it's very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
People don't understand that or appreciate it.
Yeah. The next section I thought was probably the most interesting, starting on page 82, right, discussing what his idea of aristocracy was. This is fascinating. He gives a good summary of
Yeah.
what we were just talking about, though, at the top of page 82. Right, according to Adams, men are foolish, men are corrupted by the passion of emulation and by other appetites. To suppose that men are sagacious and benevolent is to betray them into anarchy. He says, and there's another mistake of the French theorists. They think that men naturally being equal, society will be perfect when the state of equality enters into legislation. He says, well, men aren't naturally equal. He says a caveat, right? Men possess moral equality, which is from God, and they have juridical equality, each a right to his own, the essence of justice. But that there are so many equivalent physical beings, so many atoms, is nonsense. Right? That there is moral and juridical equality, but just in the natural state of affairs, right, we're not going to have equal things. And assuming that if we just make every law equal, if we try to equalize every person by the law, then everything will be perfect. Well, that's just a ridiculous idea. And Adams was particularly opposed to that here.
Yeah, and and he does a great job of summarizing his views, which starts on the next page
Hmm.
in a second. But these discussions always remind me of the Rush song. I think it's titled "Trees,"
Hmm.
where the oaks and what are I should have listened to it before I came up. But there's like the tall trees are stealing the sun, and
Mm.
so the other trees are fed up and living in the shade of the other trees. And at the end, they all become equalized through axe and saw.
Mm.
And I just think that's just it's I don't know if I mean I assume they mean as a criticism of communism or of that kind of forced equality, but I don't know what their political persuasion is, but that's the way I read it. But I like how he just and this is what I was alluding to earlier. You know, aristocracy in America is we think of as the royalty, like dukes and duchesses and
Hmm.
princes and hereditary succession and power just from birthplace. But the way he defines it, as the author summarizes, is he's got a number of numbered paragraphs, which I
Hmm.
was helpful. But he talks about aristocracy. An aristocrat is somebody who can command more than his own vote. Like, and,
Hmm.
and I view that as somebody that doesn't necessarily forcibly control another vote, but he has supporters and people go along with him, and that's a real thing.
Hmm.
Like people will say, well, even like, not that I'm super influential, but people will ask me close to elections if there's a contested judicial election, hey, who do you think will be a better judge? And I'm not saying that they're necessarily going to vote the way I say, but if I give them a good reason one way or the other, I'll probably carry those votes for whoever it is I think is going to be better because people just don't know who
Hmm.
the judges are or whatever.
Right.
But then he talks about, aristocracy. The second one is that aristocracy is not simply a creation of society. It's part natural, part artificial, and it cannot be eradicated.
Hmm.
So there's always, as people say, we're a hierarchical species. We always have leaders, and you're not going to be able to eliminate that type of leveling up, among the people.
Hmm.
And then the more most form the third one is the most form a common form of aristocracy is produced by differences in nature, which positive legislation cannot alter substantially. So
Right.
if somebody is smarter, more articulate, and is a born leader, there's some reality to that, and people will that some people are natural followers. They
Hmm.
don't want to be in the front of the pack, leading everybody and taking that responsibility, and they want to be able to trust somebody they'll lead them through, and that naturally would create some sort of hierarchical structure, even if everybody agrees to it,
Hmm.
which are really our elections. And then the fourth one, I mean, goes. I don't know if I need to go through all of them because there's
Right.
8. But this, that's it's not this hereditary. Even a hereditary aristocracy is not dependent upon positive law for its existence.
Hmm.
So it can exist. And you see this. I don't know if you're really meaning this, but like, we kind of have hereditary advantages. Like Rand Paul,
Hmm.
his father was Ron Paul, who was a celebrity politician.
Right. Or
You
the
know,
Kennedys or the Bushes, we do have sort of, not royal families, but,
yeah,
in a similar, not a similar sense, but in the sense that Adams is talking about. I mean, they have
yeah,
name recognition.
yeah. We'll probably have. I mean, we'll probably have some Trumps. Whether it'll be kids or
Hmm.
grandkids or nieces or nephews or great nieces and nephews, or probably they'll have some cachet. And so there, he goes through some other factors. And I think really what he's talking about is not what we would commonly view as aristocracy. It would just be hierarchy, within
Hmm.
the society. You have
Right.
some leaders and some followers, and even if you say you're going to outlaw it, you're still going to have it.
Hmm.
It's the nature of any human society, and,
Right.
and and if that's what it is, then I think everybody agrees. And the author says, ultimately, Jefferson agreed with these general principles. Well, who can argue with those?
Hmm.
Because if that's what you mean, if you define it as something I agree with, of course I'm going to agree with you. But that's what I was talking about earlier. I don't know if that was exactly what he always believed. That
Right.
limited definition. But
Yeah. Yeah, I do like this definition a lot, and I think it's really good to see sort of laid out here, just that idea that someone who commands more than his own vote. 'Cause I think a lot of the time when you see a lot of the people on the left, right, sort of carrying over these arguments from the French Revolution of like any sort of inequality is inherently immoral, right? Any difference in outcome is inherently wrong, et cetera, et cetera. I always think it's funny then that they then form essentially like political action groups or unions. They're just setting up their own smaller aristocracy, right? What are you doing? Well, you're setting up a group of people to argue on your behalf because you think that they are better at arguing on your behalf than you are. Well, you're just making a new hierarchy. You're setting up a hierarchy to try to eliminate whatever hierarchy it is you're currently against at the moment, right? And you just don't see that that's what you're doing. You'll see this a lot. You'll see them talking about, especially the more communist sort of idea of, we'll set up unions, set up, workers of the world unite, wield your power, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now you're just setting up a different hierarchy. You can't abolish the hierarchy. The hierarchy will always exist, or the aristocracy will always exist. It'll just be a different one. And it'll probably be worse than the one that has existed for a longer time, right? If you just try to reset and make a new one from scratch, it's probably not going to be any better.
Yeah, because the struggle to create the existing hierarchy over generations has already kind of weeded it out
Hmm.
so that the abhorrent leaders would have been thrown out, hopefully.
Hmm.
And so if you start over from scratch, you have to fight off all comers type of thing, and the rivalries, and so it can be more violent. But you're right, maybe it's just from a perspective of somebody that's on the right like myself. It seems like the left is much more hierarchical, much more deferential to their leaders, and
Hmm.
much more unified, and they really don't like to have criticism of the group out among the out group. If that makes sense. Like if it's one thing to criticize members of the club, Democratic Party or whatever it's going to be, among yourselves in a private meeting. But if you
Hmm.
publicly criticize somebody of your own side, then it's anathema.
Right.
Where the people on the right seem to just go for each other's jugular for no reason at all, or any reason or no reason at all. And I know I'm overstating it on both sides of that, but I think there is more of a tendency to fall in line with the hierarchy on the left, who are always screeching about how they, no
Hmm.
kings and all that. But the no kings people are the same people that want to stack the Supreme Court. They want to do
Right.
away with filibuster. They want to have direct elections for all issues. Not only just not get rid of, basically get rid of representative government, which is, a straight line to totalitarianism.
Right. Right.
So it's ironic, I guess you'd say.
Mhm. Well, that brings us to the next section here, getting more into his political philosophy rather than just sort of his, I guess, social philosophy. But he says the happiness of society is the end of government, right? Government's purpose is for the happiness of society, the well-being of society. He says private and public virtues are the primary concern of Adams, right? It's not this materialist sort of happiness, utilitarian happiness, but these sort of cultivation of virtues, right? Justice as the aim of society. The concept Adams preferred the concept of virtue to the concept of freedom, right? Sort of realizing that you can very easily confuse liberty for license, right? Sort of this cultivation of virtue is really the point. What he says on page 87, right? He says, liberty, in short, cannot be discussed in the abstract as if it were totally independent of public virtue in the framework of institutions. Adams's realization that freedom is a delicate plant, that even watering it with the blood of martyrs is dubious nutriment, impels him to outline a practical system for liberty under law. Liberty must be under law. There is no satisfactory alternative. Liberty without law endures as long as a lamb among wolves. Right? You need these institutions. You need this cultivation of virtue provided by law, provided by what the structure of society is, so that you can have liberty.
Yep.
Otherwise, and I like that analogy a lot. It's like a lamb among wolves.
Yep. And and um and continue on. I'm skipping ahead to 90,
Yeah.
but maybe fast. But he believed in prescriptive liberties, and he wrote this book, in defense of the Constitution, and really was an advocate of the separation of powers with the three branches of government. And I have not read that. But it's described as, a lawyer's brief rather than a philosophic treatise, going through other examples of these types of government where you have a judiciary, you have a
Hmm.
executive, and you have a legislature, and there is some, there's some basic philosophical. basis, foundation for those types of roles being separated in different people.
Hmm.
And you can see it, or I can see it, as little known, like in small towns, you have usually a mayor. In Missouri, you have a mayor and you have a board of aldermen or a city council. And that's it, really. I mean, there's a court system if there's going to be a fight between the two, but it's not often involved. But the mayor presides over their meeting, and so it's almost like a parliament, but
Hmm.
it's different because there is a veto and this and that. So it's kind of a melding in a way of the legislative and the executive,
Hmm.
especially in the statutes, because the statutes provide for the board of aldermen to decide on the day-to-day operations on some level. And so you could see the challenges of that because there's like there's struggles of who's in charge and that sort of thing, and but there's a natural understanding that, well, there should be somebody running the day to day, and there should be somebody setting the rules,
Hmm.
for the day to day, the actual, you know, 10,000 foot rules. You can do this or can't do that. And when it's grouped together, it does create problems. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, I really like his emphasis throughout here, right? There's a big block quote on page 92 that I won't read all of, but he says, by the authorities and examples already recited, you'll be convinced that three branches of power have an unalterable foundation in nature, and that they exist in every society, natural and artificial. All right, there's something that just makes sense about that, right? And I just like his argumentation here of, well, it's not, again, sort of going back to how we started, right? It's not just creating something new from whole cloth. It's just relying on what we know about humanity, and what we know about sort of political structures from across all of history, that this gives good results because it aligns with human nature, not trying to create something new, some weird new leveling project or this, complete innovation, but it makes sense.
Yeah, and maybe I should articulate a little better. So, like, whenever you have a group of people taking action,
Hmm.
well, okay, we're either going to do X or Y. You get together and somehow you figure out whether to do X or Y, and then you got to do either X or Y. So let's say you decide to do X. Somebody's got to be in charge. Like a one person has to be in charge of doing it.
Hmm.
Because you have too many chiefs and not enough Indians. You have, because if you're all chiefs, then you're like nothing will get done because you'll be arguing over how to do it. So
Hmm.
that's the fun. That's the way I view the fundamental difference between the executive and legislative. The legislature is making those policies and say, okay, we're going to go down that path. We're going to go X, and it's up to the executive to do the X.
Hmm.
And then they have the judiciary, which is when the other two are fighting over it, or some other issue comes up in doing the X, and you have to figure out wherever the disputes are. But it's not making the decision on what to do, and it's not actually doing the do. It's deciding arguments about who's going to decide what to do and how to do it. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Yeah.
And separating those roles is so effective in controlling, so the executive just doesn't get to decide everything that they're doing,
Hmm.
and the legislative doesn't get to decide how everything is done,
Hmm.
the nuts and bolts, and the judiciary doesn't even make the decisions on either of them, but decides disputes and is more separated from the actual hands-on decision making and actual doing of the deeds.
Yeah. I'm just
Right?
even thinking about like conversations that I've had with other people, right? Trying to make a decision, even if it's something like super trivial, right? And you often do have somebody or a few people who are sort of proposing ideas. What are we going to do? How are we going to get there? Some one or two, few people say, well, this is what we're going to do to get there. And then somebody else will pop up, well, we haven't considered this other thing, right? We need to think about this, right? And if they have a big objection, right? And then it's always funny. I'm trying to think of specific examples. I can't think of any off the top of my head. But if the guy who has an objection starts to put forward an entirely new idea, we're like, well, hang on. You were just objecting to this one part of the original idea. Why do we have to completely change course? It's like you've overstepped your bounds in some way. You were just the
Right.
objecting guy, right? You were the one saying that there's a problem here, not that we need to do something completely different, right? And providing solutions to how to resolve this problem rather than going down a different path, right? And so it's this sort of cordoning off different roles. I think even in just discussion on what to do in very practical matters, I think you see that just borne out in the structure of the Constitution.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it is a real. division of responsibilities that exists in society. Um, and if it isn't divided, it invites trouble. And
Hmm.
I think Adams recognizes that and articulates it in a philosophical arena.
Right.
Yeah.
And I like what he says on 95. He says his arguments for a proper division of powers have become so familiar to Americans that they may appear wearisome truisms, but it is
Yeah.
Adams who made them truisms. His learning and his candor, almost unaided, obstructed in the United States a flooding intellectual sympathy with French theories of idyllic benevolence, omnicompetent single assemblies, and unitary states. And I think here again, like we talked, we might be giving Adams a little too much singular credit. I mean, definitely Hamilton, some of these other guys were definitely a part of that in sort of curbing these sort of French influences. But I think it is worthwhile to uphold Adams here as sort of stemming a lot of that flow.
Yes.
But
Yes.
that kind of brings us to his conclusion section here,
Yes.
starting at page 96 here through to page 98. Um, right, but he says, yeah, the Constitution of the United States has been the most successful conservative device in the history of the world. Adams's share in the work, however considerable as influence, still was wholly indirect, for Adams was in London when the convention met. Jefferson was abroad too, so that the two chief American political thinkers of that age did not participate in the transcendent political accomplishment of modern times. So it's interesting to see, these two sort of opposing sides weren't actually there for the drafting of the Constitution, but you see how their thought has worked in through other people.
Yes.
Right at the time of the drafting, right? There's clear Jeffersonian influences in the Constitution, very clear. I don't know what the adjective form of Adams is. Adams-esque, Amesian influences. I guess Adamic is at least that's how you refer to the Adam, like the Adamic covenant. Um,
I refer to you as Adamses, like Hobbitzes,
yeah, that's great.
which
Uh,
is fills our requirement to have a Tolkien
that's
reference.
true. We have to have at least one.
Well, he also mentions, John Marshall's
Hmm.
usurpation of constitutional authority by just claiming that the Supreme Court has this authority to decide what's constitutional, which was just pulled out of his hat.
Hmm.
But it did, and then other issues about interstate commerce and had a salutary effect on resolving those issues for sure. Whether or not that power has been appropriately used in the last 100 years is certainly up for debate.
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh, but it's an important part of Adams's legacy,
Hmm.
because he appointed the guy, I think, or
Hmm.
maybe did he appoint him or did?
He might have been.
I think so. I think he might have
Yeah.
appointed him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. He was Adams' Secretary of State. It was Adams who appointed Marshall to the
yeah,
bench, which he dignified. Yeah.
yeah, and so that's a product of his philosophy and his thought, on the
Hmm.
bench. But and if you didn't have that, you wouldn't have as a defined separation of powers among the three, because
Right.
otherwise, the court would just decide individual cases between litigants,
Hmm.
and not these broad, sweeping decisions these 9 people in robes make for all of us.
Right.
Which
I did see
hopefully,
a funny, it might have been Babylon Bee or whatever, but it was, the district court overrules the assassination of Khamenei,
yeah,
um, orders U.S. to bring him back to life. Yeah, that's great. I like his final paragraph here, just to wrap things off.
yeah,
He says, and by a prolongation of that influence, the conservative essence of federalism has endured down to modern America. If it has been a buttress of that national covetousness which Adams detested, still it has been the means of preserving Adams' principle of political balance, liberty under law. Federalism has had a great share in keeping the United States the most conservative power remaining in the world, and thus in the middle of the 20th century, the conservatism of Adams exerts an influence quite as strong as the radical social principles disseminated by his French adversaries. So much John Adams, with his outward vanity and his inward humility, never would have expected. That was a nice way to end.
yes. So what were your thoughts,
I thought it was
John?
good. I thought it was good. I actually haven't read much of Adams directly, so this is a good way to get into his thought. He was also a huge proponent of classical education.
Yes.
He's got a great letter that he wrote, and especially his son, John Quincy Adams. I actually have Quincy Adams's. It's a 2-volume set of his lectures on rhetoric and oratory that I got at the book sale at Truman from the Pickler Library. But I haven't read those yet. But yeah, big proponent of classical education, which I think is interesting, talking about sort of his influences and sort of the conservatism of Adams here. He's got a great letter. I forget who it was written to. where he says,
Let me interrupt you there. Isn't it just a tragedy that that library at a liberal arts college sold that for like pennies on the dollar?
"Oh
Why
yeah,
would
I think it was
why
two
wouldn't they
dollars
keep
for me to
that?
get those
Why
two
would they
volumes."
not keep that
Yeah,
in on the shelf?
it's a
What's the
great
hurt?
question.
Well, efficiency. What the what are you talking about?
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, I interrupt you.
Yeah, that's right. And they're nice, like green. They've got like sort of gold letters on the side too. It's a nice looking, 2 volume set over there that I still haven't read yet. But sort of his classical education, I think is interesting to talk about here too. I mean, all of the founders were classically educated, right? They were reading Latin and Greek. We kind of touched on it a little bit when he was discussing, right, all of the different sort of governments that were set up, and referencing Polybius and things like that. So I think that means a lot to a lot of the American founders here of what they were reading, what they were encountering was a lot of these more ancient influences and saying, well, these structures have worked throughout all of history, right? This says something about human nature, right? We can read these ancient Greek, ancient Roman philosophers and say that there is a purpose for virtue in the state. And I think that's one of the big accomplishments of the American Revolution, the American Constitution, that not only was it preserving sort of the existing colonial way of life, but it was very much informed by classical ideas of virtue and justice and liberty and things like that. So, sort of providing a philosophical basis by not providing a new philosophical basis, just drawing on what was already known. And I think that's what makes it such a conservative project that has worked so well.
Yes, agreed. And it's like modern politicians have no idea how dangerous true, direct democracy could be. I mean, they don't understand. Well, oh, we need more democracy. No, we really don't.
Right.
We need to have, more effective republic. People don't even know this is a republic.
Right.
This is not a democracy
Right.
for a lot of really good reasons. And it seems like almost nobody who's an elected leader mentions that, very rarely does.
Hmm.
So
I
yes,
agree.
agreed.
Well, do you have any other final thoughts for this
No,
episode?
I
All
do
right. Well,
not.
then this has been season 14, episode 3 of Unlimited Opinions. You can, of course, follow it on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I have been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.